Before we proceed to the vidcast, deliver your like as a token of loyalty. Enact subscription to strengthen our ranks. Invoke the hype protocol, and declare in the commentarium upon which world you would choose to reside. Your service is noted. For the Emperor!
In the grim darkness of the far future, one would be forgiven for thinking every human world is a hellhole of misery and war. After all, the Imperium of Man isn't exactly known for its quality of life. But today we're exploring a startling exception to that rule, a realm often called the shining jewel of the Imperium's galactic east. Welcome to Ultramar, the legendary 500 worlds of the Ultramarines. Yes, you heard that right, 500 worlds. Not one planet, not a handful, but an entire sub-empire of humanity thriving under the guidance of one of the Imperium's greatest heroes. If that sounds almost too good to be true, well, in some ways it is. Ultramar is a beacon of order and prosperity in a galaxy defined by chaos and decay. It's a realm where people live, comparatively, decent lives, where cities are orderly and productive, and where the whole society isn't one minor tech malfunction away from collapsing into medieval squalor. In a universe where average planetary governors can barely keep the lights on, Ultramar stands out like an overachiever in a class full of underperformers. So what exactly is Ultramar? Who runs it, and how did it come to be so different from the typical Imperial world? Why do Warhammer 40K fans speak of the 500 worlds with a mix of admiration and maybe a bit of envy or sarcasm? This script is going to dive deep into the lore of Ultramar, from its heroic founding by the Primarch Roboute Guilliman, through its trials in galactic wars, all the way to its current resurgence in the 42nd millennium. By the end, you'll know why Ultramar is basically the Imperium's answer to the question, what if we actually did things right for a change? Strap in for a journey across half the galaxy into a realm of hope amid darkness. We'll cover everything, the official lore, the epic history, and plenty of context for newcomers. And don't worry, we'll keep it beginner-friendly and maybe even throw in a dash of dry humor. All right, let's get started unraveling the story behind Ultramar, the 500 worlds. Just remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But in Ultramar, at least you get well-organized war with a 5-star administration. Now that's something. Chapter 1. The 500 Worlds, a Realm Apart. To understand Ultramar, you first need to appreciate just how different it is from a typical Imperial territory. The official definition, Ultramar is a quasi-autonomous sub-empire within the Imperium of Man, consisting of roughly 500 inhabited worlds. It's essentially an empire within an empire, ruled not by the usual imperial bureaucracy, but by the Ultramarines chapter of Space Marines. In other words, where most Space Marine chapters just guard a single home planet, or a lonely fortress monastery in some wasteland, the Ultramarines oversee an entire swath of space. This realm is located way out on the eastern fringe of the galaxy, basically the Imperium's frontier, about as far from Holy Terra as you can imagine. Ultramar's capital world is Macragge, a heavily fortified industrial planet and the home of the Ultramarines. Surrounding Macragge are hundreds of other planets, each part of an interconnected society that Roboute Guilliman, more on him soon, carefully cultivated. The region is divided into several sectors or provinces. In the modern era, Ultramar is organized into 5 sectors: North, South, East, West, and Central, each overseen by a tetrarch, a sort of high governor chosen from among Guilliman's champions. All sectors ultimately answer to Macragge. This tidy administrative setup is a far cry from the usual messy Imperial sector governance, and it's one reason Ultramar runs so smoothly. What's so special about these worlds? For one, they're prosperous and comparatively well-governed. For 10,000 years, Ultramar's planets have been beacons of productivity and stability. Each world is largely self-sufficient, yet they all trade with each other in a robust network. Ultramar has industrial worlds churning out high-quality goods, agri-worlds with actual, edible food, not corpse starch, and even a famed garden planet named Iax that used to be the breadbasket of the realm. The population of Ultramar lives in clean, well-planned cities, surrounded by green fields and clear seas. Pollution is kept in check. Unlike so many Imperial Forge worlds, Ultramar's industry hasn't turned its planets into toxic wastelands. This balance between industry and environment might sound almost idyllic, because by 40,000 standards, it is. It's said that until some recent calamities, the average person in Ultramar could expect to live into their mid-30s. Now, for us today, that sounds tragically short, but in the 41st millennium, hitting your 30s without being killed by war, disease, or starvation is practically a luxury vacation. That statistic alone speaks volumes about how life in Ultramar beats the living daylights out of being a hive city drudge on some other world. Ultramar society is disciplined and loyal. The people are educated, again, relative to the Imperium's usual medieval norm, and generally law-abiding. There's a sense of civic pride across these worlds, not least because many have a tradition of sending their best and brightest youth to attempt induction into the Ultramarines. Each planet in Ultramar takes pride if one of their own becomes a mighty space marine. Public squares display statues of famous Ultramarines born on that world. Being related to an Ultramarine is a badge of honor for generations. This culture of honor and service helps keep rebellions and heresy almost non-existent in Ultramar. Seriously, it's noted in lore that Ultramar has essentially no recorded cases of large-scale rebellion or chaos cult uprisings from within. Contrast that with basically every other Imperial sector, constantly battling its own polluted, starving masses or putting down cults left and right. In Ultramar, people actually trust their government. They might grumble about taxes like anywhere, but deep down they know the system works, because it actually does. Now, politically, how does Ultramar fit into the Imperium? Officially, Ultramar is part of the Imperium of Man, subject to the Emperor's laws. It's just given an unusual degree of autonomy. The Ultramarines Chapter Master, sometimes bearing the title Lord of Ultramar or Lord Macragge, acts as the de facto head of state for the region. The Imperium recognizes that the Ultramarines govern these worlds in the Emperor's name. For the most part, Terra leaves Ultramar alone as long as it's loyal, which it is, fiercely. The worlds of Ultramar don't pay the standard Imperial tithes, the usual heavy taxes of grain, manpower, etc. that most planets owe. Instead, they channel their resources into supporting the Ultramarines and their own local defense. Don't think for a second that makes Ultramar a freeloader. In fact, Ultramar's productivity is so high that its worlds raise and equip entire regiments of the Imperial Guard, known as the Ultramar Auxilia in their region, above and beyond their local needs. Hundreds of regiments from Ultramar have been sent off to fight in the Emperor's wars all across the galaxy. These soldiers tend to be superbly trained and outfitted by Guard standards, since they come from a region where everything is efficient and high quality. So, Ultramar more than pulls its weight. It just does so on its own terms. Because of this unique situation, some Imperial commentators historically gave Ultramar the side-eye, jokingly calling it a new empire, or hinting that it was almost its own separate kingdom. But Guilliman and the Ultramarines have always been adamant that Ultramar serves the Imperium. It's not a rival to Terra, just an unusually well-run part of it. In truth, the Imperium could probably learn a thing or two from Ultramar's example, not that most Imperial leaders would ever admit that openly. It's a delicate balance. Ultramar's semi-independence is tolerated because it gets results. If some no-name planetary governor tried to secede and run their own mini-empire, they'd get a visit from the Inquisition and a few Space Marine strike cruisers before you could say heresy. But when the beloved Ultramarines do it, and do it so well that their region is a bulwark against countless enemies, well, exceptions are made. Defense-wise, Ultramar is formidable. Each world maintains its own planetary defense force, the Ultramar Auxilia. And these are not ragtag militias. They are as disciplined and well-equipped as any in the galaxy. The region also fields the Ultramar Defense Fleet, a standing navy patrolling Ultramar's space lanes, ever vigilant for pirates or invaders. Key shipping routes and approaches to major planets are protected by massive void fortresses. The largest of these, the Star Fort Gallatin, is said to have enough firepower to obliterate a moon and is shielded to near indestructibility. And on top of all that, of course, are the Ultramarines themselves, a full chapter of elite Space Marines stationed right at Ultramar's heart on Macragge, ready to respond to any threat. Since the upheavals of the current era, more on that later, Ultramar now even hosts several other Space Marine chapters permanently as additional guardians, swelling the superhuman defenders of the realm to many times what they used to be. In short, if you want to attack Ultramar, bring a really big army and write your will beforehand. So that's Ultramar in a nutshell. A stellar realm of roughly 500 worlds, governed by superhuman warriors with a talent for administration, inhabited by humans who actually enjoy a decent life by grimdark standards. It's an island of relative sanity in a sea of war and horror. Of course, Ultramar didn't get this way by accident. It took an extraordinary leader and 10,000 years of history to forge this paradise in hell. To truly grasp Ultramar's character, we need to travel back to its beginnings, to the time of legend when one man set out to build a better empire amid the stars. And that man is none other than Roboute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines. Let's dive into Ultramar's origin story. Chapter 2. Rise of Ultramar. Roboute Guilliman's early reign. Every great realm has to start somewhere, and Ultramar's story begins on the planet Macragge in the days before the Imperium arrived. Macragge was a human colony world that had actually weathered the Age of Strife, the long, chaotic millennia when warp storms cut off worlds and human civilization largely collapsed. Unlike so many planets that fell into barbarism, Macragge stayed relatively civilized and even maintained tenuous contact and trade with a few neighboring systems. By the time our protagonist enters the scene, Macragge is ruled by a constitutional government led by 2 consuls. One of these co-rulers is a man named Conor Guilliman, an able and just leader dedicated to his people. The other is a fellow called Gallan. Spoiler, he's the scheming villain of this chapter. Enter Roboute Guilliman. As an infant, the future Primarch literally fell from the sky. Like all Primarchs, Roboute was one of the Emperor of mankind's 20 genetically engineered superhuman sons, stolen away by dark forces and scattered across the galaxy as babies. Roboute's capsule landed in the mountains of Macragge, where he was discovered by a group of local hunters. Recognizing that this was no ordinary child, legend has it the baby was calm and observant, gazing at them with a fierce intelligence. They brought him to Conor, the ruling consul. Conor effectively adopted Roboute, raising him as his own son. Roboute grew up in an environment of education, statesmanship, and military discipline. From an early age, he demonstrated astonishing intellect and physical prowess. Primarchs basically win the genetic lottery after all. By age 10, he was outsmarting his tutors. By his teens, he was commanding armies. The people of Macragge came to admire Roboute as a prodigy and natural leader. However, not everyone was thrilled by this golden boy's rise. Co-consul Gallin had always desired absolute power and now feared being upstaged by Connor's superhuman heir. While Roboute was away leading a military campaign against savage Highland tribes, the Battle of Illyria, a test of his leadership, Gallion launched a coup back in the capital. Gallin bribed and manipulated a portion of the military to seize control of the government. His forces attacked the Senate House, where Connor was located, and a bloody civil conflict erupted. Connor and his loyalists held out, barricaded in the Senate, fending off traitor soldiers amid chaos and looting in the streets. As soon as word reached Roboute of the treachery, he marched his army back to the capital with all haste. Picture the scene. The city is burning, a drunken rebel mob rampages, and Connor's loyal guards make their last stand protecting their wounded consul. Roboute arrives like the wrath of the gods. He and his veteran troops smash through the rebels, relieve the siege of the Senate House, and rout Gallin's forces. Roboute himself fights his way to his father's side. Tragically, Connor has been mortally wounded by an assassin's blade and is dying. In his final moments, Connor imparts his last counsel to Roboute and reveals Gallin's betrayal fully. Grief-stricken and furious, Roboute Guilliman does not fall into despair. He acts. With cold, methodical resolve, he takes command of Macragge. Gallin and the conspirators are hunted down and executed for their treason. The coup is crushed utterly. In the aftermath, Roboute is acclaimed by the people as the new sole consul of Macragge. He basically becomes the absolute but benevolent ruler overnight, propelled by both his lineage and his proven capability. Now Roboute sets about rebuilding and reforming Macragge in a way only a Primarch could. He has a singular vision: to create the ideal society. First, he revamps the government and social order. The corrupt noble elites who supported Gallon have their lands and titles stripped. Instead, Roboute elevates those who showed loyalty and merit. Hardworking common citizens suddenly find doors open to them that were once shut. Roboute establishes a meritocracy. If you contribute to the prosperity and stability of society, you are rewarded and included, regardless of your old aristocratic status, or lack thereof. Lazy parasites and lawbreakers, on the other hand, get harsh, even draconian punishment. It's a very shape-up or ship-out in a coffin approach, but it works. He reorganizes the economy so that wealth isn't hoarded by a few nobles, but is reinvested in infrastructure and industry. Under Roboute's direction, technology that had been locked away by aristocrats is disseminated to improve production and daily life. Farmlands are expanded and improved to ensure plenty of food. The planet's military is restructured into a well-equipped, disciplined force, loyal not to individual nobles, but to Macragge itself. Within a short span, Macragge is thriving like never before. Roboute's rule is firm but remarkably fair. He's not a tyrant bleeding the people dry. He genuinely wants the population to prosper. Productive citizens make a strong society after all. Crime is dealt with swiftly, but merit and honor are rewarded. Macragge becomes a model of order, productivity, and justice. Again, grimdark justice, but justice nonetheless. Now, a Primarch is nothing if not ambitious on a grand scale. Roboute wasn't content with fixing just one world through Macragge libraries. He had studied ancient history, learning that humanity once spanned the stars. He dreamed of reuniting humanity and restoring civilization across the void. With Macragge as a stable base, he began reaching out to neighboring star systems. Remember, Macragge had kept contact with a few nearby worlds even during isolation, trade partners and such. Guilliman capitalized on those links. He sent diplomatic envoys and trade missions to bring other planets into cooperation. He also wasn't shy about using military force where needed. If a nearby world was ruled by despots or beset by anarchy, Guilliman's armies intervened to bring peace and fold those worlds into Macragge's growing domain. Some worlds joined willingly, attracted by the chance to be part of this flourishing order. Others were conquered if they were too far gone in chaos. Either way, Guilliman started to forge a small interstellar confederation. It's during this period that Roboute names his nascent federation Ultramar. The term comes from an old human word meaning beyond the sea. In this case, beyond the Sea of Night. Ultramar would be a realm beyond the darkness of old night, a beacon of light and order. And true to that name, trade routes between Macragge and its sister worlds are established and vigorously protected. Within a few years, Guilliman has an enclave of stable systems exchanging resources and knowledge. Macragge gets raw materials and talent from other worlds. In return, those worlds get security, new technology, and inclusion in something greater. Everyone benefits, at least everyone who plays by the rules. Pirates, warlords, and would-be oppressors get crushed without mercy. Then destiny comes knocking in the form of the Emperor of Mankind. The Emperor's Great Crusade, his effort to reunite all human worlds into a new golden age, had been raging across the galaxy, but very far from Ultramar. Eventually, around the year 30,000 or so, one of the Emperor's expeditionary fleets pushes out to the eastern fringe. They reach a planet called Espandor, a fringe world that had contact with Ultramar. The Emperor hears incredible reports. There's a powerful human warlord out here, building an enlightened empire on the galactic edge, and a canny suspicion arises. Could it be one of his lost sons? The Emperor likely had some psychic inkling too, as tales suggest. However, just as the Emperor's fleet sets course for Macragge, freak warp storms erupt around Ultramar's space. In Warhammer, the warp has a cruel sense of humor. These storms are so bad even the Emperor can't immediately force through. For 5 years, Macragge and its neighbors are cut off by raging warp disturbances, and the Emperor has to hold off. Meanwhile, within that bubble, Roboute keeps on doing what he does best, improving Ultramar. By the time those warp storms finally subside and the Emperor arrives at Macragge, Guilliman has not only maintained order, he's expanded it dramatically. Macragge is shining like a jewel, its cities rebuilt in gleaming marble and steel, its armies well-equipped and looking to the stars for new horizons. Guilliman has begun building starships of his own and preparing for larger endeavors. So when the Emperor of Mankind at last steps foot on Macragge, he finds something unique, a Primarch's son who has already created a miniature version of the imperial ideal on his own. The Emperor is, by all accounts, delighted, possibly even relieved. Roboute Guilliman meets his true father for the first time, and there's mutual respect right away. No rebellion, no tests of strength needed. Guilliman kneels and swears loyalty on the spot. He had long theorized that he must be part of some greater design. He knew he was not a normal man, after all, and now the answers stand before him. The Emperor officially makes Roboute the Primarch, Supreme Commander of the Ultramarines Legion, a massive army of space marines engineered from Guilliman's own gene seed. Conveniently, that legion was already named Ultramarines, whether by fate or just naming conventions, and operating elsewhere in the galaxy. But now their gene father had been found. The Legion's headquarters is moved to Macragge to merge with Guilliman's forces. Imagine tens of thousands of elite space marines, fresh from conquering distant stars, suddenly arriving to join Guilliman's burgeoning Ultramar empire. Combined with Guilliman's own planetary armies and fleets, it's a match made in heaven, or perhaps forged in war. With the Emperor's blessing, Guilliman is about to take Ultramar to heights undreamed of. Thus, Macragge and its allied worlds become officially part of the Imperium of Man, but as a distinct realm under Guilliman's leadership. The groundwork is laid for an expansion of Ultramar on a galactic scale. The stage is set, a wise and powerful Primarch at the helm, a legion of super soldiers at his back, and a mandate from the Emperor to bring many more worlds into compliance. Ultramar's golden age is about to begin in earnest, as the 500 worlds truly take shape during the Great Crusade. Chapter 3: Ultramar in the Great Crusade, Forging the 500 Worlds. With Roboute Guilliman at the helm and the Emperor's Great Crusade in full swing, Ultramar entered a golden era of expansion. Now officially part of the Imperium, Guilliman and his Ultramarines Legion were tasked with bringing countless worlds into compliance. Imperial control. Guilliman approached this mandate with the same systematic efficiency he applied on Macragge, but now on a galactic scale. The result was the rapid growth of Ultramar from a local enclave into a vast stellar empire encompassing hundreds of planets. The Ultramarines Legion itself swelled in size, fed by recruits from Ultramar's ever-increasing roster of worlds. In fact, the 13th Legion became the largest of all the Emperor's Space Marine legions. While other legions often suffered horrendous attrition in brutal war zones, the Ultramarines, by fate or design, were frequently deployed strategically, where their logistical and organizational skills let them conquer with fewer losses. Combine that with Guilliman's growing recruitment base, he could draw hardy youths from dozens of civilized worlds now, not just one. And by the end of the Crusade, the Ultramarines numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They were an army big enough to pacify whole sectors on their own. And they often did exactly that. Guilliman's method of war was as much about rebuilding as it was about destroying enemies. A typical campaign under Guilliman went like this. The Ultramarines arrive at a human world that's fallen into anarchy or been subjugated by aliens. They make a swift, decisive strike to eliminate the oppressive regime or Xenos overlords. Then, instead of just planting a flag and zooming off, Guilliman establishes a lasting imperial presence. He installs administrators, often drawn from Ultramar's population or the Legion's own ranks, to help set up a functional local government. He uses the Legion's resources to jumpstart infrastructure, repairing cities, restoring power grids, setting up schools and industries. You name it. In short, each world isn't just conquered, it's uplifted and incorporated into Ultramar's cultural and economic network. Many worlds eagerly joined this prosperous federation once liberated. Who wouldn't want to be part of the empire that actually treats its people well and brings tangible improvements? Of course, if a ruler refused or an alien empire stood in the way, the Ultramarines were no less ruthless than any Space Marines. They crushed plenty of Orc warlords, human tyrants, and minor Xenos empires during Ultramar's expansion. But afterward, those worlds would be rebuilt as new jewels of Ultramar. It's a carrot-and-stick approach. Resist and face the Ultramarines' wrath. Surrender and enjoy the benefits of Guilliman's enlightened rule. Over roughly 2 centuries of ceaseless campaigning, Guilliman's realm expanded from a handful of systems to literally hundreds. This is the era when the term 500 Worlds of Ultramar truly takes shape. Now, was it literally 500 worlds? The sources often say more than 500, implying that's a rounded figure, a symbol of its vastness. but 500 is a good ballpark for the late Great Crusade period. Each star system in Ultramar might itself contain multiple inhabited planets or moons, so it's a huge swath of space however you count it. Guilliman organized Ultramar's expansion carefully. He divided his realm into subdomains, each overseen by one of his top commanders, precursors to the tetrarchs we discussed earlier. These lieutenants, often captains of the Ultramarines, were granted authority to govern groups of worlds. Essentially, Guilliman set up a feudal yet merit-based hierarchy. Worlds owed allegiance and resources to Ultramar as a whole, and trusted Ultramarines officers served as governors to ensure things ran according to Guilliman's grand vision. For example, Macragge remained the capital, the political and military center of Ultramar. Calth developed into Ultramar's industrial powerhouse and primary shipyard world. Its massive forges and manufactoria were so productive that at one point they nearly rivaled Macragge's output. Ajax became known as the Garden of Ultramar, a verdant breadbasket whose vast farms fed not just Ultramar's own citizens, but also supplied the frontline Crusade forces with food and medical supplies. Connor, named after Guilliman's father, evolved into a true forge world of the Adeptus Mechanicus, a center of manufacturing and technology in Ultramar that churned out weapons, starships, and munitions for the Ultramarines and their allies. Armatura was a heavily fortified planet that served as a giant military training base and staging ground. It was essentially one big garrison and arsenal, producing armies and war material, and its people were all well-versed in warfare. Prandium was maintained as a paradise world, a resort and cultural gem showcasing the prosperity and quality of life Ultramar could achieve at its height. Prandium's forests and seas were legendary. Alas, that beauty would attract the Tyranids later, but we'll get there. Thalassar, an ocean planet with stormy seas and hardy islander populace, contributed a strong naval tradition to Ultramar's forces and produced tough recruits used to harsh environments. And then there were the three planets of Massali, Quinton, and Torrentus, a trio of agri-worlds terraformed and coordinated to function together, providing a vast surplus of crops and foodstuffs. These three operated in tandem, with opposite growing seasons, etc., to ensure Ultramar never lacked for food. Essentially, each world in Ultramar had a role to play. Each was a bright thread in the tapestry of Guilliman's domain. Collectively, these systems came to be known as the 500 Worlds of Ultramar, and the realm truly lived up to that name on the eve of the next Great Crisis. While Guilliman was expanding Ultramar, he was also a major leader in the wider Great Crusade. His Ultramarines fought alongside other legions in many campaigns to bring humanity together. There was a healthy, and sometimes not so healthy, rivalry with his brother Primarchs. Some, like Rogel Dorn or Sanguinius, respected Guilliman's organizational genius. Others found him a bit too perfect for their taste. A certain jealousy brewed among some. After all, while their homeworlds might still be recovering or their legions battered, here was Roboute with a personal empire of 500 thriving worlds. One particularly fateful incident highlighting such tension was the compliance of a planet called Monarchia. Monarchia was the gleaming capital city of a human civilization nurtured and worshipped by the Word-Bearers Legion, led by Primarch Lorgar. Lorgar's approach was the opposite of Guilliman's. He zealously worshipped the Emperor as a god and built a theocratic society devoted to that worship. The Emperor, never keen on being seen as a god, grew displeased with Lorgar's slow, reverent approach to conquest. To teach Lorgar a lesson, the Emperor ordered Guilliman and the Ultramarines to utterly destroy Monarchia, the perfect city that Lorgar cherished, while forcing the Word-Bearers to watch. Guilliman, ever the dutiful son, followed orders. Monarchia was razed to ash in a day, and Lorgar and his legion were made to kneel in the dust and receive a stern lecture from the Emperor. This humiliation cut deeply. It earned the Ultramarines the undying bitterness of Lorgar and the Word-Bearers. Guilliman considered it an unfortunate duty carried out for the greater good. Fanaticism like Lorgar's had no place in the Crusade, he reasoned. But the seed of hatred was planted in Lorgar's heart. Tuck that away for now. It will explode violently a bit later in our story. By the close of the Great Crusade, Ultramar was at its height. It was the pride of the Imperium's eastern frontier, often held up as an example of, here's what we're fighting for, a human civilization that actually works. Roboute Guilliman had essentially written the playbook on how to govern worlds efficiently. Literally, he wrote volumes of organizational doctrine and military treatises during this time. If one of his Primarch brothers needed advice on logistics or administration, they often turned to him. He was called the Avenging Son, and sometimes the Master of Ultramar. From Macragge, Guilliman could look at a map of his 500 worlds and see a legacy of order that he and his sons built with their own hands. However, the galaxy was not destined to enjoy peace for long. Even as Ultramar reached this pinnacle, a storm was brewing that would engulf the Imperium, a civil war that would test Ultramar as never before. The Horus Heresy was about to erupt, and Guilliman's 500 worlds sat squarely in the sights of those who would see the Emperor's dream burn. Let's move into those dark times and see how Ultramar weathered the greatest betrayal in human history. Chapter 4. The Horus Heresy, Ultramar under siege. Just as Ultramar reached its zenith, the unthinkable happened. The Imperium was torn apart from within. In the grand drama of Warhammer 40k, this is the Horus Heresy, the galaxy-spanning civil war where the Emperor's favored son, War Master Horus, and half the Space Marine legions turned traitor against the Imperium. While the main events of the heresy would climax far away on Terra, Ultramar was far from spared. In fact, it became a major front in the war, targeted for destruction by the traitors. Roboute Guilliman and his Ultramarines found themselves under attack by former comrades fighting for the very survival of their home realm. Horus knew that Guilliman's Ultramarines were a key loyalist strength. Their numbers and Ultramar's resources could tip the balance if given the chance to muster against him. So, even before open rebellion was declared, Horus, secretly corrupted by chaos, devised a way to cripple the Ultramarines early. The tool he chose was Guilliman's bitter rival, Lorgar, Primarch of the Word-Bearers. Lorgar had nursed a deep grudge since the humiliation at Monarchia. By the time of the heresy, Lorgar had become a dark apostle of chaos and was eager for vengeance. The trap was set on the world of Calth. Under the pretense of a joint military operation, the Word-Bearers Legion and elements of the Ultramarines Legion gathered together on Calth, a major ultramarine industrial planet. Ostensibly, they were to launch a cooperative strike into the nearby Orc-held territories. The Ultramarines, trusting their brothers, arrived in force, including Guilliman himself, and assembled for a grand send-off in Calth's orbit and on its surface. It was to be a glorious day until it became an infamous one. Without warning, the Word-Bearers unleashed a devastating surprise attack. It was treachery on an almost unimaginable scale. As Ultramarines' ships were docked and unprepared, the Word-Bearers' fleet opened fire at point-blank range. Orbital defense platforms the Ultramarines thought were friendly suddenly bombarded Guilliman's vessels. On the ground, Word-Bearers' legionaries turned their guns on unsuspecting Ultramarines during what was supposed to be a peaceful joint parade. The result was carnage. Many Ultramarine warships were annihilated in the opening minutes, caught with shields down. Thousands of space marines died before they even knew they were under attack. Guilliman himself was nearly killed when traitors bombed the command bunker he was in. The Battle of Calth had begun, one of the most notorious betrayals in the Horus Heresy. It raged across orbital space and the planet's surface. The Ultramarines, though staggered, were not completely defeated in the first blow. They fought back ferociously. Captain Remus Ventanus and others rallied companies on the ground. In space, Ultramarine warships scrambled and managed to take down some word-bearer vessels after the initial surprise. However, the word-bearers had another vile edge. They had secretly corrupted Calthas' star. Using sorcery and arcane tech, they caused Calthai's sun to erupt in a deadly cascade of radiation. A wave of solar fire blasted the planet, poisoning its atmosphere and bathing it in mutagenic UV rays. All combatants on Calth's surface suddenly had a new problem: lethal radiation. The Ultramarines were forced to retreat into underground shelters and arcologies to survive. The word-bearers, largely willing to die for their dark cause and having prepared some shielding, followed them into the tunnels to continue the fight in the dark. Ultimately, the Ultramarines did manage to win a costly victory at Calth, if victory means driving off the traitors. The word-bearers were on a schedule. They had done the intended damage and had orders not to get bogged down. So Lorgar and most of his forces left Calth after inflicting maximum mayhem. They left a ruined world behind. Calth's once thriving surface was now an irradiated wasteland. To this day, 10,000 years later, the people of Calth live in subterranean cities because the surface is still lethally radioactive. That's how badly the word-bearers hurt it in just that one day. The Ultramarines Legion itself was savaged. Estimates vary, but perhaps a quarter of the Legion was wiped out at Calth. Remember, they were the largest Legion. Even after losing tens of thousands of Astartes, they still had a lot remaining. But the blow was severe, not to mention the blow to morale and trust. Yet the attack on Calth was just the beginning of Horus and Lorgar's campaign against Ultramar. With communications to Terra cut and Ultramar reeling, the traitors launched a sector-wide invasion of Ultramar. This is often called the Shadow Crusade. The Word-Bearers, now joined by Angron's World Eaters, another traitor legion known for its insane, bloodthirsty berserkers, spread out to attack Ultramar's worlds on multiple fronts. One by one, Ultramar's remote planets came under assault. The World Eaters, who basically live for slaughter, fell upon strategic worlds like Armatura, Ultramar's fortress training planet. The defense of Armatura was valiant. Ultramarine garrisons and militias put up fierce resistance. But Angron's horde was unstoppable and the planet was devastated. Other worlds with smaller defenses simply vanished in flame without even getting a message out. It's said that about 1/5 of Ultramar's 500 worlds were lost in just this short, frantic period. Think about that. Roughly 100 worlds burned or conquered by the traitors in a blitz. The Ultramarines were used to being the ones doing the conquering. Now they were desperately playing defense across a whole realm with an enemy who appeared everywhere at once like ghosts. The term Shadow Crusade is apt because it was a war of sudden strikes and dark sorcery, largely hidden from the rest of the Imperium due to the warp disruptions. Lorgar, steeped in chaos lore, performed a massive ritual to deepen the crisis. Together with his word-bearers, Dark Priests, he created the Ruin Storm. This was an immense warp storm that engulfed Ultramar's entire region of space. The Ruin Storm essentially severed Ultramar from the rest of the galaxy. Warp travel and astropathic messages in or out became nearly impossible. Ultramar was on its own, utterly isolated from any help. Each world had to fend for itself, and Guilliman had to manage defense with whatever forces he could maneuver internally, which was made very difficult by the warp disturbances. Sending fleets between systems was perilous and slow. Some Ultramar worlds heroically managed to hold off or even defeat their invaders, despite the chaos. There are tales of outposts that fought off traitor assaults on their own. For instance, the world of Astagar was led by an Ultramarines officer, Lucretius Corvo, later founder of the Nova Marines chapter, who rallied the defense and actually repelled a Word-Bearer's incursion. There were scattered Void victories too. A colossal Word-Bearer's battleship called the Furious Abyss, built in secret to terrorize Ultramar, was hunted down and destroyed by a scratch fleet of loyalist ships before it could unleash its full havoc. But for every bright spot, there were more tragedies, where whole cities or continents were butchered by Cornate, blood god-crazed, world-eaters, or corrupted into charnel pits by the Word-Bearers. The pinnacle of the Shadow Crusade's savagery came when Lorgar and Angron lured Guilliman into a trap on the planet Nuceria. Now, Nuceria was actually Angron's own original homeworld, a world of brutal slavery and gladiatorial fighting where he had suffered before being found by the Emperor. It wasn't originally part of Ultramar, but events drew the fight there. Lorgar orchestrated matters so that Guilliman's forces pursued the traitors to Nuceria, hoping to corner Angron and Lorgar and end their rampage. What the Ultramarines didn't fully realize was that Angron was undergoing a horrific transformation. Angron had always been psychologically unstable. The man had butcher's nails driven into his brain that made him permanently hyper-violent. Long story. And the warp powers of chaos were elevating him to something even more monstrous. On Nuceria, during the climactic confrontation, Lorgar essentially completed a ritual that turned Angron into a demon prince of the blood god Horn. Guilliman and his warriors suddenly faced not merely a Primarch, but a hulking warp-fueled, demonic Primarch at the head of an endless tide of crazed world-eaters. The Ultramarines had to retreat. There was no stopping Angron in that state. It's worth noting the entire population of Nuceria was basically annihilated in the process. Angron got a sick revenge on his birthplace by slaughtering what remained of it amidst his ascension. After that, the Shadow Crusade began to wind down. Lorgar had achieved his primary objectives: butcher Ultramar's strength, lock them away behind the Ruin Storm, and make a grand offering to chaos in the form of Angron's ascension and countless massacres. Angron, now a demon Primarch, eventually heeded Horus's summons towards Terra for the final stages of the heresy. Lorgar, too, shifted his attention to other schemes in service of chaos. There are hints he grew wary of directly fighting Guilliman further and instead went to cultivate his newfound chaos power elsewhere. The Word-Bearers and World-Eaters left a shattered Ultramar in their wake. Guilliman and the Ultramarines were left picking up the pieces in a realm cut off from all outside aid. It's hard to overstate the confusion and psychological blow of these events. The Ultramarines, proud and unshakable, had been blindsided by brothers they once trusted with their lives. Guilliman himself, an eternal planner, had been outplayed by an unpredictable foe using methods he considered unthinkable, demonic sorcery and such. Guilliman was a rationalist, so dealing with literal demons was not on his everyday to-do list. However, true to character, Roboute Guilliman did not collapse under the strain. He began reorganizing and fortifying what was left of Ultramar, preparing for the worst and hoping for the best. One of his first realizations was that the Imperium, or at least the Imperium as they knew it, might well have fallen. With the Ruin Storm severing all contact, for all Guilliman knew, Terra could have been conquered and the Emperor slain. He faced the grim prospect that Ultramar could be the last bastion of human civilization left standing, and thus was born a bold and controversial idea. If the Imperium was lost, Ultramar would have to become a new Imperium, a second empire of man to keep humanity alive. This idea would crystallize into something called Imperium Secundus, which we'll discuss fully in the next chapter. But as a preview, Guilliman essentially thought, better to have a backup Imperium out here than to sit idle if the original one has fallen. It was a plan born out of both despair and hope. Despair at the thought that the Emperor's realm was no more, hope that they could preserve its embers in Ultramar. So, as the Horus Heresy raged elsewhere, with the Ultramarines unable to reach Terra for the final decisive battles, Ultramar itself entered a unique chapter of its history. The realm had been bloodied, but not broken. Guilliman still had a very large force. Remember, even after their heavy losses, the Ultramarines likely still numbered on the order of 100,000 Space Marines, plus countless Ultramar auxilia troops and local militias. He also soon found himself with some extraordinary company in Ultramar. Other loyalist Primarchs who got trapped behind the Ruin Storm. Cut off from the rest of the war, these loyalist leaders prepared to make Ultramar the new center of Imperial civilization if necessary. The heresy's shadow over Ultramar would lead not only to great tragedy, but also to an experiment in governance that would never be repeated. An Imperium within the Imperium. Before we get to that, consider Ultramar's state at this juncture. The 500 worlds have been pruned harshly. Many are in ruins or occupied by enemies. Communications are down and fear is everywhere. Yet on Macragge, Roboute Guilliman stands resolute amid the turmoil, determined that humanity will not lose everything. The coming of Imperium Secundus is at hand. Chapter 5, Imperium Secundus, Ultramar's Second Empire. Cut off from Terra, and fearing the worst, Roboute Guilliman undertook one of the most extraordinary political experiments in Imperial history, the creation of Imperium Secundus, Latin for Second Imperium. This was essentially a backup Imperium based in Ultramar. If the Emperor and Terra had indeed fallen to Horus, then Guilliman reasoned humanity needed a surviving center of authority to prevent total collapse. It was a radical move, verging on outright heresy in the eyes of some, but Guilliman saw it as a grim necessity given the information he had. He wasn't alone for long. Fate delivered 2 more Primarchs into Ultramar during this turbulent period. First came Lion L. Johnson of the Dark Angels. The Lion had been hunting the Night Lord's traitor legion across the galaxy. He captured their Primarch, the murderous Conrad Kurz, Night Haunter, and while transporting that prisoner was drawn to Macragge partially by the psychic beacon of Ultramar's Pharos device on Sothar, an ancient alien lighthouse that Ultramar's forces had activated to signal loyalists. The Lion arrived with a substantial force of Dark Angels, although his arrival was dramatic in its own right, because Kurz managed to escape confinement and cause chaos on Macragge. Yes, at the same time Ultramar is trying to reorganize, the Night Lord's Primarch was skulking around Macragge's shadows, committing acts of terror. It was tense, to say the least. Hot on the Lion's heels, Sanguinius of the Blood Angels also turned up in Ultramar. Sanguinius and his legion had been waylaid in their own trials, fighting a demon horde in the Cygnus cluster, and then flung off course by the Ruin Storm. Guided by visions and possibly by the Pharos beacon signal, the Blood Angels eventually made contact with Ultramar's forces. Sanguinius, angelic, noble, belovedest by all, was perhaps the best possible person to have present in this time of despair. Where Guilliman provided logic and structure, Sanguinius provided hope and inspiration. Now, imagine Macragge at this moment. 3 loyalist Primarchs, Guilliman, Sanguinius, and Lion L. Johnson, all gathering with their forces in one place, something that hadn't happened since the Great Crusade's triumphant days. Yet around them, the 500 worlds are still largely isolated, and nobody knows the truth of what's happened on Terra. They only know that Horus rebelled, and that they themselves have been attacked and cut off. It's in this context that Guilliman proposes Imperium Secundus. The idea is formalized in a council between the Primarchs. Guilliman doesn't claim the new throne for himself. Instead, he suggests that Sanguinius become the regent, effectively the acting emperor of this second Imperium. Sanguinius, at first, is reluctant. He's humble and utterly loyal to the real emperor, but he is eventually persuaded that if the emperor truly is gone, someone of pure heart and vision must carry the torch. Sanguinius agrees to serve as the figurehead leader. He is proclaimed emperor, regent, of Imperium Secundus in a solemn ceremony on Macragge. It's a bit surreal. The Ultramarines, Dark Angels, and Blood Angels essentially crown Sanguinius as a replacement emperor in Ultramar, even as the true emperor still sits on the throne of Terra unbeknownst to them. Guilliman takes the title of Lord Protector or Lord Warden. Accounts vary on the exact wording. Basically, he remains the chief administrator and strategist, the role he's naturally suited for. The Lion is given command of the combined military forces, besides each Primarch still directly leading his own legion. The Lion, however, remains somewhat skeptical of the whole affair. He's always been a secretive one and wasn't entirely convinced the Emperor was gone. Tensions simmered, especially because Conrad Kurz, Night Haunter, was still on the loose, skulking in the shadows on Macragge and committing serial murders to terrorize them. Kurz, being the twisted creature he is, tried to prove that even under Guilliman's glorious rule, he could bring fear and anarchy. He succeeded in assassinating some key individuals and nearly killed Sanguinius at one point. There's a whole subplot of Kurz tormenting the Lion and Guilliman, including an attempt on Guilliman's life, all while Imperium Secundus was setting up. Eventually, the Lion confronted Kurz directly and brutally injured him, leaving him for dead, though he didn't kill him outright. Long story there, but basically Kurz would later be captured and executed after the heresy. This internal drama aside, the leadership of Imperium Secundus stayed intact. Imperium Secundus endured for some time, several months at least, possibly a year or more. Time measurement in the warp-stormed realm was tricky. During that period, Ultramar effectively became the heart of a separate Imperium. They established their own ruling council, enforced imperial law across Ultramar as best as they could, and tried to uphold the ideals of the Emperor. Sanguinius, sitting on a makeshift throne on Macragge, was a reluctant emperor. Guilliman administered the provinces and military. The Lion acted as a grim enforcer, hunting any sign of dissent and hunting Kurz in the shadows. Importantly, Guilliman and Sanguinius treated it clearly as a temporary contingency. They stated that if evidence came that the Emperor and Terra still stood, they would immediately dissolve this second Imperium. In other words, they weren't usurping power, they were safeguarding it. That evidence does come eventually. Thanks to the Pharaoh's beacon on Sotha and some daring deeds, in the novel Pharaohs, some Ultramar defenders sacrificed themselves to send a far-reaching signal through the ruin storm. The loyalists on Macragge receive fragmentary news that Terra has not yet fallen. Moreover, as the ruin storm mysteriously begins to recede, in part due to some grand psychic effort by Sanguinius and others, he had visions guiding him, Guilliman realizes the Emperor might still live. The turning point is when a lone astropathic message or vision finally punches through, confirming that the Emperor's beacon still shines. Some versions suggest Sanguinius himself, with his prescience, became convinced that the Emperor was alive, and Horus had not yet triumphed. Upon this realization, Sanguinius, who had been tormented by the moral burden of taking his father's mantle, immediately decreed that Imperium Secundus had fulfilled its purpose and must now be dissolved. He refused to wear a crown that belonged to the Emperor for one moment longer than necessary. True to their word, the Primarchs dismantled Imperium Secundus. The experiment ended voluntarily and amicably. They all swore renewed loyalty to the one true Imperium. In practice, nothing much had changed on the ground. Ultramar was still Ultramar, but this symbolic act was crucial. It showed Guilliman's fundamental loyalty and humility. He never truly wanted a divided Imperium. He wanted to save what he could. The moment he believed the Emperor's Imperium still had a chance, he set aside his rulership and returned wholeheartedly to being a subject of the Emperor. With the ruin storm finally abating enough for travel, the three Primarchs then prepared to do what they had wanted to do all along: rejoin the war against Horus. The plan was for Guilliman, Sanguinius, and Lion L. Johnson to take as much of their legions as possible and break through the warp storms to reach Terra. However, chaos had delayed them well enough that time was nearly up. Sanguinius and the Blood Angels managed to rush toward Terra. They would famously arrive in the nick of time to take part in the final battle, the Siege of Terra. The Lion's path took him on a different course. After clashing with Kurz and dealing with some other obligations, the Dark Angels ended up not reaching Terra before the end of the Heresy, instead liberating other worlds and later heading toward their own home region. Guilliman likewise started moving his Ultramarines towards Terra, but Horus's rebellion reached its climax too quickly. In the end, Horus was defeated at Terra in that fateful duel aboard his flagship with the Emperor, which left Horus dead and the Emperor mortally wounded. By the time Guilliman and his Ultramarines forces emerged from the warp into more central Imperial space, the heresy was effectively over. The traitors were in retreat after the death of Horus and the shattering of their forces following the Siege of Terra. There's a poignant note that Guilliman was furious and heartbroken that he hadn't been able to arrive earlier. He and his Ultramarines had intended to reinforce the Loyalists on Terra, but thanks to the ruin storm and all the chaos, they simply couldn't get there in time. It's an enduring bitterness in Guilliman's soul that he wasn't there to fight alongside the Emperor in the final hour. However, arriving in the aftermath meant Guilliman had a crucial new role to play, helping pick up the pieces of a broken Imperium. Ultramar and its forces were intact, and now fully reconnected to the wider galaxy. Guilliman swiftly transitioned from war fighting to statecraft. The Imperium had no time to waste. Traitor remnants still held large swathes of territory, and everything was in disarray after the Galactic Civil War. Drawing on his experience running Ultramar, Guilliman essentially took charge of rebuilding the Imperium. He was named Lord Commander of the Imperium, effectively the Emperor's regent in matters of governance, and oversaw the Great Scouring, the campaign to chase the traitors into the Eye of Terror, and vast administrative reforms. But before we get ahead into those reforms, let's focus on what all this meant for Ultramar. The Horus Heresy, with its horrors, had proven to Guilliman the dangers of giving too much power to one man, even a Primarch, and the flaws in the old Legion system. It also left Ultramar devastated in parts. Once the ruin storm cleared and Ultramar was reopened to the broader Imperium, Guilliman directed the Ultramarines to secure their realm again and aid any world still plagued by traitors. There was a lot of cleanup to do in the Eastern Fringe. Scattered bands of word-bearers or world-eaters who hadn't gotten the memo that Horus lost, demagogues trying to stir up chaos cults in the power vacuum, and so on. The Ultramarines stamped these out firmly. More importantly, as the dust settled, Guilliman had to decide how Ultramar would fit into the new Imperium moving forward. The heresy was over. The Emperor was alive but grievously wounded, now interred on the Golden Throne in a deathless state, and Guilliman himself was effectively running Imperial operations as Lord Commander. Would Ultramar remain an almost separate empire, or would it be folded entirely under direct Imperial control? Guilliman's decision was characteristically principled. He believed that after the heresy, the time of Space Marines ruling as feudal lords should end. The heresy had shown that even superhumans could fall to hubris, and that the Imperial citizenry should not be solely dependent on warrior kings, no matter how well-intentioned, holding personal empires. So, as we transition to the post-heresy era, Guilliman made a momentous choice for Ultramar's future: to dismantle parts of Ultramar's autonomy for the greater good of the Imperium. It's time for the reformation of the Imperium, and Ultramar's role is about to change. Chapter 6: Reformation. Ultramar after the heresy. The Horus Heresy was over, but its repercussions reshaped the galaxy, and Ultramar forever. Roboute Guilliman emerged as the architect of a new Imperium in the aftermath. He penned the famous Codex Astartes, a comprehensive tome outlining new rules and organization for the Space Marines. One major outcome of this was the second founding of Space Marine chapters. Guilliman decided that no single man should ever again command the kind of power a full Space Marine legion represented. The risk of another Horus was too great, so he divided the legions into smaller autonomous chapters of about 1,000 Marines each. For the Ultramarines Legion, this was a massive split. They were, at that point, still tens of thousands strong. Guilliman's own Ultramarines would become one chapter, and the rest of his veterans were broken off to found a host of new chapters. Names like the Nova Marines, Genesis Chapter, Ultramarines Praetors, Praetors of Ultramar, Silver Skulls, Scythes of the Emperor, Sons of Orar, and many more, either came directly from this second founding or later foundings using Guilliman's gene seed. Each of these successor chapters might take stewardship of a region or a particular world, some even within the old Ultramar region, others sent far afield to spread their excellence across the Imperium. This feeds into Guilliman's next transformative act: the political reorganization of Ultramar itself. He had no intention of maintaining his 500 worlds as a personal fiefdom outside the main imperial structure. Quite the opposite. Guilliman believed strongly that the loyalty of Ultramar to the Imperium must be absolute and unquestioned. So he relinquished direct control over the majority of Ultramar's worlds. Many planets that were once under the Ultramarines Legion's governance were handed over to the normal Imperial administration or to the stewardship of the new successor chapters. Some worlds became independent Imperial sectors of their own, with their own planetary governors now answering to Terra rather than Macragge. Others were given to successor Astartes chapters as new homeworlds, for instance the Genesis chapter, composed largely of Ultramarine veterans, took on guardianship of a portion of Ultramar's southern reach, and chapters like the Nova Marines eventually established themselves on worlds at Ultramar's periphery. When the dust settled, the realm of Ultramar was officially a much smaller domain. The Ultramarines chapter retained Macragge and its immediately surrounding systems, amounting to roughly a dozen key worlds. These included Macragge, Kolth, which, despite being ravaged, was still inhabited. Its population had moved into underground caverns and vowed to rebuild. Connor, the Forge world and anchor of the northern zone. Espandor, a cardinal world, religious center, in Ultramar South. Eax, the garden world of Ultramar. Parmenio, a strategic garrison and training planet. Prandium, sadly marked destroyed after the wars, but counted among the realm's worlds until its destruction. Thalassa, the ocean world. Thalassa Prime, a world that became an inquisitorial fortress, interestingly. The three planets, Masali, Quinton, Tarentus. the interlinked Agri-World trio, and perhaps a couple of others like Circe or Occluda that were near the core. All told, Ultramar proper was now essentially a subsector of about 8 to 12 major inhabited worlds and their moons, rather than hundreds. This was a deliberate scaling back. Guilliman did not want his chapter of Space Marines to continue directly ruling over scores of civilian planets. The worlds he kept under Ultramarines' stewardship were largely those critical for the chapter's operation, or already culturally tightly bound to Macragge. Everything else either became autonomous or was overseen by new chapters. The people of those planets still remembered being part of Ultramar, of course. There remained a cultural unity. But politically, Ultramar had been trimmed to a fraction of its former size. The Ultramarines chapter, now roughly 1,000 strong instead of 250,000, kept control of the original political and economic center of Ultramar. Those dozen worlds, and that was it. For those core worlds, life went on much as before. They benefited from the chapter's protection and wise administration. All the worlds that once comprised the larger realm in the region still shared a common cultural heritage with Macragge. They had similar architecture, governmental structures, etc., thanks to Guilliman's legacy. But formally, they were no longer all under one unified Ultramar Imperium. It surprised many that Guilliman voluntarily gave up such power. But he believed it was necessary. He had seen what unchecked power combined with transhuman hubris could do, Horus's revolt for one. He felt Space Marines should no longer directly rule over humanity as feudal lords in peacetime. The new imperial order should be one of institutions and laws, not personal empires. It speaks volumes about Guilliman's character that he gave up an empire for the good of the galaxy at large. He even wrote into the Codex Astartes that no chapter should ever control more than a planet and its moons as a domain. A rule many chapters follow, though ironically, in modern times, Guilliman himself will decide to undo his own rule, as we'll see later. A perhaps melancholy footnote to this era, Roboute Guilliman did not get to preside over his realm or the Imperium for very long after the heresy. Approximately a century later, some accounts say about 150 to 200 years into the Great Scouring, Guilliman faced off against his traitor brother Fulgrim, Primarch of the Emperor's Children, who by then had become a depraved demon prince of Slaanesh. In that duel, Fulgrim managed to inflict a mortal wound on Guilliman with a poisoned blade. The toxin was chaos-tainted and incurable. Guilliman was retrieved by his Ultramarines, but he was on the brink of death. In a desperate bid to save him, they placed him in a stasis field, essentially frozen in time at the exact moment of death, within the Temple of Hera on Macragge. There he lay, neither alive nor dead, for millennia. To the Imperium at large, Guilliman became a sort of mythical figure suspended in time. On Macragge, people would make pilgrimages to see the Primarch's body in stasis, some praying as if he were a saint, others simply paying respects to the great man. The Ultramarines kept hopeful vigil over his perfectly preserved form, believing one day he might return if the Emperor willed it. Without their Primarch's active presence, the Ultramarines and Ultramar soldiered on, guided by his teachings and memory. They had capable chapter masters and the Codex Astartes to steer them, and the realm of Ultramar remained true to Guilliman's vision across the centuries. For most of the next 9,000 years, Ultramar experienced relative calm, as much as can be expected in Warhammer 40k anyway. The eastern fringe was distant from many of the galaxy's constant flashpoints, like the Eye of Terror. That said, relative calm still involved the occasional invasion or crisis. Nothing in 40k stays peaceful forever. In M32, during the cataclysmic Orc onslaught known as the War of the Beast, Ultramar found itself under threat by rampaging Orc forces. Orcs actually managed to land on worlds like Quinton, and even the idyllic Prondium, causing destruction. However, the Ultramarines, under Chapter Master C. Ventinus, by some accounts, and their allies repelled these greenskin incursions. Ultramar endured and rebuilt any damage swiftly. The Orcs learned the hard way that Ultramar's worlds were not easy prey. Over the long middle millennia, the Ultramarines chapter continued to campaign not just in Ultramar, but across the galaxy when called upon. They earned renown in countless conflicts, from pushing back Chaos pirates to aiding other sectors under Tyrannid assaults. Ultramar itself, though, largely avoided being a primary battleground until much later. The discipline and order in Ultramar society prevented internal strife that plagued other areas of the Imperium. Where many imperial worlds fell into rebellion or succumbed to heretical cults over the centuries, Ultramar's population stayed remarkably loyal and stable. The local authorities, with discreet help from the Ultramarines' own agents, like the Vigil Operti, a sort of secret security bureau, kept tabs on sedition and stamped out chaos influences before they could spread. One could say the worst crime you'd typically find on an Ultramar world during these millennia might be a smuggling ring or a corrupt factor. Nothing like the planet-wide uprisings that are common elsewhere. It was as close to an orderly utopia as the Imperium could boast. Thus, through the Great Scouring, the Nova Terra Interregnum, the Age of Apostasy, and other historical upheavals, Ultramar remained a rock of stability. It sent forth armies when needed. It produced some of the Imperium's best bureaucrats and generals. Ultramar's education system churned out competent officials who often ended up serving in the wider Imperium, and it maintained that ethos of do things right. Sometimes other Imperial commanders would grumble that Ultramar had it easy out there, far from the worst trouble spots, coddled by Guilliman's legacy. But none could argue with Ultramar's results. Fast forward to the late 41st millennium. This is when Ultramar's peace would truly be shattered by new, terrifying threats from beyond. The galaxy was darkening again. New alien dangers were looming in the void, and even an empire as well prepared as Ultramar would find itself challenged to the breaking point. The next chapters of Ultramar's story would be written in the blood of the Tyrannic Wars and the fire of chaos assaults, and ultimately with the miraculous return of the avenging sun himself. But before the dawn, as always, comes the deepest night. Ultramar's mettle was about to be tested as never before in the 41st millennium. Chapter 7. Tyrannids, Warbands, and New Threats. Ultramar's trials in M41. For thousands of years, Ultramar had been a haven of stability, but the late 41st millennium brought threats of a scale unseen since the Horus Heresy. The first, and perhaps most infamous, was the arrival of the Tyrannids, extragalactic predators, a swarming hive of bioengineered horrors bent on devouring all life. The Imperium at large had no idea these creatures existed, until they smashed headlong into Ultramar. In 745 M41, Hive Fleet Behemoth, the first Tyrannid incursion in Imperial records, slammed into the eastern fringe. Ultramar's outlying monitoring stations and frontier colonies started going dark. By the time anyone realized what was happening, a tide of Tyrannid bioships was bearing down on Ultramar's core systems. This was the opening of what became known as the First Tyrannic War. The Ultramarines, under Chapter Master Marneus Calgar, scrambled to mount a defense. They met the Tyrannids in space at the battles of Prondium and Macragge. Prondium, Ultramar's beautiful paradise world, was the first to face the onslaught. Despite desperate defense by Ultramar's navy and planetary forces, The Tyranids completely overran Prandium. The alien swarm literally consumed the planet, its forests, its animals, its millions of people, reducing Prandium to a barren rock. By the time the Tyranids were done, there was nothing left but a lifeless husk. Prandium's complete destruction was a shock to Ultramar, one of their cherished worlds erased in a matter of days. Marneus Calgar regrouped the Ultramarine fleet and drew the Tyranids toward Macragge, determined that the capital world would not fall. The space battle in Macragge's orbit was massive and brutal. Calgar's tactics and the sacrifice of many brave crews managed to shatter the main Hive fleet, but numerous Tyranid bioships broke through and disgorged countless hordes onto Macragge's surface, particularly at the planet's polar regions where the Ultramarines maintained fortress garrisons. What followed was one of the Ultramarines' most heroic and costly battles. At Macragge's northern polar fortress, the Ultramarines' First Company, their veteran elite, many in Terminator armor, under Captain Invictus made their stand. Wave after wave of Tyranid organisms assaulted the fortress. Immense carnifexes, living battering ram beasts, swarms of scythe-limbed gaunts, chameleon-like lictors lurking in the blizzards. The Ultramarines fought with disciplined fury, mowing down Xenos by the thousands. But the Tyranids are numberless and know no fear or fatigue. Slowly, inexorably, they began to overwhelm the defenses. Captain Invictus and the First Company sealed themselves in the innermost keep of the polar fortress, holding the last line to the bitter end. When relief forces finally reached that chamber, they found every one of those veteran Ultramarines dead, surrounded by mountains of slain Tyranids. The First Company had been annihilated to the last man, but they had not yielded an inch. Their sacrifice stalled the Tyranid advance long enough for Calgar to regroup and ultimately defeat the remaining Tyranids on Macragge's surface. Meanwhile, in orbit and beyond, Calgar engaged the Tyranid Hive Tyrant, the monstrous leader beast of the swarm, in single combat on the bridge of his flagship. In that famous duel, Calgar's honor guard were slaughtered and Calgar himself was gravely wounded by the tyrant's claws. But in the end, he punched his power fist straight through the Hive Tyrant's giant skull, killing it. With the tyrant dead, the central synaptic control of the Tyranid swarm fractured. The remaining Tyranid fleet was then lured into a trap and destroyed by a concerted Imperial counterattack, including a heroic ramming maneuver by the Imperial battleship Dominus Astra that took out the largest Hive ship. The battle for Macragge was won, barely. In the aftermath, the Ultramarines surveyed a bittersweet victory. They had saved Ultramar from being consumed, but at terrible cost. The Ultramarines chapter had lost nearly half its fighting strength, including almost all of its veteran First Company. Entire esteemed squads and heroes who had fought for centuries were gone. It's often said that such a blow might have destroyed a lesser chapter entirely, but these were Ultramarines. They rebuilt and restructured with remarkable speed, drawing on the exceptional human resources of Ultramar's worlds for new recruits. Still, the loss stung deeply. The chapter erected the Shrine of the Warriors at Macragge, where the bodies of the fallen First Company were preserved in stasis beneath the fortress, an enduring memorial to their sacrifice. The Tyranid menace had also sounded an alarm for the entire Imperium. Ultramar's astropathic distress, calls, and eventual victory reports informed the wider galaxy of the Tyranids' existence. Thanks to Ultramar's sacrifice and record-keeping, trust Guilliman's sons to meticulously document even the war that nearly killed them. The Imperium at large learned of this new extragalactic threat. Ultramar's fight essentially provided the crucial intelligence and time for the rest of the Imperium to prepare for later Tyranid invasions. In that sense, Ultramar saved untold worlds beyond itself by taking on the first swarm. The Tyranids weren't done with Ultramar, however. Decades later, another hive fleet named Kraken in 993 M41 invaded the galaxy, splitting into many tendrils and attacking across a wide front. Ultramar saw some of these incursions, though the brunt of Kraken's assault hit sectors to the galactic north and east of Ultramar. Notably, one of Ultramar's proud successor chapters, the Scythes of the Emperor, had their homeworld Sotha completely destroyed by Hive Fleet Kraken. Sotha, which once hosted the Pharaoh's Beacon and had been part of Ultramar's extended family, fell after a valiant last stand by the Scythes. The chapter was nearly wiped out. Only a few dozen Scythes survived, escaping in ships. Those survivors ended up seeking refuge on Macragge and fighting alongside the Ultramarines afterward, earning Guilliman's admiration later. Ultramar itself managed to avoid the worst of Kraken, largely thanks to the lessons learned from Behemoth and bolstered defenses. The Ultramarines led preemptive strikes to break up Kraken's splinter fleets before they could mass near Ultramar's core. Even as the Tyranids remained an ever-present threat in the eastern fringe, with new hive fleets like Leviathan looming on the horizon by late M41, Ultramar faced other challenges as the millennium drew to a close. One particularly dangerous event was a chaos invasion launched by an Iron Warriors warsmith named Honsu. This occurred a bit after the first Tyrannic War, and it's chronicled in the Ultramarines novels as the War of Ultramar, or the Battle of Talassar. Honsu, a bitter enemy of the Ultramarines, he had a grudge after an Ultramarine named Uriel Ventris foiled his plans on Medrengard, assembled a massive warband of Chaos Space Marines, Dark Mechanicus engines, and traitor guardsmen. He infiltrated Ultramar through an ancient warp route and attacked several worlds. The most notable clash was on Talassar, an Ultramar world known for its ocean and stormy weather. Honsu's forces besieged Talassar's main hive city, intending to make an example of it. The Ultramarines, led by Marneus Calgar and hero Captain Ventris, just returned from a death odyssey, long story, mounted a strenuous defense. The Chaos attackers even managed to drop a spire filled with plague zombies onto the city, messy business, and caused the greatest loss of Ultramarine civilian life since the Tyrannid invasion. Ultimately, Calgar confronted Honsu's forces head-on, while Ventris performed some daredevil heroics to slay Honsu's demon engine allies. Honsu, facing defeat, fled off-world swearing revenge. The War of Ultramar was costly, but the Ultramarines prevailed. It's noted in chapter records that this war saw the greatest loss of life on Ultramar since Hive Fleet Behemoth, a grim testament to how fierce the fighting was. However, it served as a stark reminder that even in Ultramar's idyllic realm, the forces of chaos could strike hard if given the chance. Another emerging threat came from the Necrons. As the 41st millennium waned, ancient Necron tomb worlds were awakening across the galaxy, including in regions not far from Ultramar. There were reports of entire outposts going silent, later found with populations mysteriously vanished and strange shimmering monoliths in their place. In one case, a moon that was being terraformed suddenly revealed itself as a Necron world, with legions of skeletal machines wiping out the colonists overnight. The Ultramarines responded to these incidents with their characteristic thoroughness, conducting search and destroy missions against Necron presences on the fringes. They managed to keep the Necron threat from reaching Ultramar's heart, but it was clear that the Necrons were a new danger that would have to be monitored. In fact, it's around this time that the Imperium first truly encounters the Necrons as well. Ultramar's reports again contribute valuable intel for the wider Imperium. In addition, the upstart Tau Empire had been expanding its borders in the Ultima Segmentum. By the end of M41, Tau exploratory fleets and diplomatic envoys were making contact, and in some cases conflict, with Imperial border worlds not terribly far from Ultramar's northeastern edge. There were minor skirmishes and standoffs as the Tau attempted to bring some fringe Imperial systems into their fold. Ultramar itself did not directly go to war with the Tau at this time. The region was a bit south of the Tau's main push. However, Ultramarines detachments were involved in Imperial campaigns against the Tau, such as the Damocles Gulf Crusade, where the Ultramarines contributed forces to halt a Tau expansion. In typical Ultramarines fashion, they approached the Tau with measured force and tactical efficiency, though any idea of diplomacy with Xenos was off the table given Imperial policy. From Ultramar's perspective, the Tau were just another potential threat to watch, albeit a relatively minor one compared to galaxy-devouring Tyranids or immortal Necron kings. Through all these trials, one thing remained consistent: Ultramar's resilience. When a world was scarred by war, whether by Tyranid digestion pools, Chaos orbital bombardments, or Necron raids, the people of Ultramar rebuilt quickly. Credit that to their culture of unity, preparedness, and shared purpose. They had stockpiles, civil defense drills, robust local leadership, all instilled by Guilliman's legacy. If a hive city's hab blocks were toppled or a continent's crops blighted, Ultramar's population didn't wait for off-world aid. They rolled up their sleeves and started reconstruction the very next day. Often the Ultramarines or successor chapter troops would lend a hand with engineering and relief efforts too. It's said Ultramar's worlds recovered in a few years from damage that would leave other Imperial planets crippled for decades. Where others might see despair, Ultramar saw a problem to solve together. By the dawn of the year 999 M41, Ultramar had endured one of its hardest centuries. It had lost tens of thousands of souls. It had even lost an entire world. Prandium's skeleton in orbit was a constant reminder. And yet, Ultramar stood unbroken, bloodied but unbowed. Marneus Calgar, now a legendary chapter master in his own right, governed Ultramar as its lord and the chapter master of the Ultramarines. The realm still shone brightly relative to the rest of the faltering Imperium. Refugees from less stable sectors even fled to Ultramar where possible, hoping to find a safer life under the Ultramarines' protection. Though not all could be accommodated, Ultramar had its limits. But even as 999 M41 rolled into early M42, the galaxy's greatest upheaval yet was about to hit. The fall of Cadia, the birth of the Great Rift, and the beginning of what many thought was the Imperium's dying gasp. In this chaos, Ultramar would face a new invasion, one that would bring back an old foe and, paradoxically, a long-lost hero. Chaos was coming for Ultramar once more, but fate had a surprise in store. The realm of Ultramar was on the cusp of its most significant transformation since the Horus Heresy. The Avenging Sun was about to return, and with him, a new chapter for the 500 worlds. Chapter 8. The Avenging Sun Returns. Ultramar in the era of the Great Rift. The close of M41 saw the galaxy in flames. Abaddon, the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade, reached its awful crescendo. The fortress world of Cadia fell, and in its wake reality itself was rent asunder. A gigantic warp rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, tore across the galaxy, severing it in two. Half the Imperium was plunged into darkness, cut off from the Emperor's guiding light. Though Ultramar lay technically on the light side of the rift, south of the dividing line, it was near its border and felt the upheaval acutely. Warp storms churned across Ultramar's skies, demonic incursions flared up on several worlds, and amidst the chaos, the forces of chaos, particularly the servants of Nurgle, launched a major invasion into Ultramar. As the 42nd millennium dawned, Ultramar was under siege by the Death Guard, the traitor legion of Primarch Mortarion. Once an ally of Guilliman in the Great Crusade, now a demon prince of Nurgle. Plague and war spread on Ultramar's planets. Amidst this desperation, hope arrived from an unlikely alliance, a tech priest Archmagos, a living saint, and a cadre of Inari Ildari, all converging with a plan to revive Ultramar's long-lost Primarch. Archmagos Belisarius Cawl had, in secret for millennia, been developing a suit of armor and biotechnology capable of healing Roboute Guilliman, anticipating the day he might be needed. During the cataclysm of the Great Rift's opening, Cawl, Saint Celestine, a revered living saint of the Imperial faith, and Eldar emissary Yvraine, high priestess of the newly awakened Ildari god of the dead, Aeneid, traveled together to Macragge. There, they fought their way through Nurgle's forces besieging the Ultramarines' fortress monastery. Macragge was embattled. The Ultramarines under Chapter Master Calgar were pressed on all sides by pox-ridden Chaos Space Marines and swarms of demons vomiting forth from the warp storms. But the unlikely rescue team reached the Temple of Hera, where Guilliman's stasis-enshrined body had lain in repose for 10,000 years. As Calgar and his Ultramarines defended the perimeter with desperate strength, Cawl installed the new advanced armor, the Armor of Fate, onto Guilliman's motionless form. Yvraine, wielding arcane power of Aeneid, channeled a surge of restorative energy. In a moment that was part science, part sorcery, and perhaps part divine miracle, Roboute Guilliman awakened from stasis. Imagine the scene. A Primarch, thought lost to time, opens his eyes. Guilliman rises from the throne in which he was preserved, now clad in shining blue artificer armor, bearing a new glowing power sword that Cawl had forged for him. To the Ultramarines and citizens witnessing it, it must have felt like a demigod reborn. Guilliman, of course, wasted no time. Though disoriented by the millennia that had passed, he immediately took command of Ultramar's defense. The Ultramarines were galvanized. Reports say some dropped to their knees in tears of joy upon seeing their gene-sire in the flesh. With righteous fury, Guilliman led a counteroffensive across Macragge. Nurgle's forces, previously holding the upper hand, were routed. A demon Primarch Mortarion, who was present leading the invasion, was utterly shocked by Guilliman's return and confronted him briefly, but decided to retreat rather than face his brother with the odds suddenly reversed. Macragge was liberated in short order. Guilliman didn't rest, though likely horrified at the state of the Imperium, the decay, the overly religious zealotry, etc., which he would later lament. He recognized that he was needed immediately. After securing Macragge, he convened a war council and made the decision to go to Terra. He needed to see the Emperor, his father, and take up the mantle of imperial leadership to save an Imperium teetering on the brink. Thus began the Tyrannic Crusade. Guilliman, with an entourage of Ultramarines, Imperial survivors, Celestine, and the Eldar allies, carved a path through the warp toward Holy Terra. It was not an easy journey. They were waylaid by a demon ambush at one point and trapped in the Maelstrom warp zone, and even had to battle their way past a greater demon of Zinch. At one dramatic moment, Guilliman was actually imprisoned in a strange warp dimension by that demon, and had to be rescued by his unlikely Eldar allies, showing how even a Primarch can be vulnerable in the warp's tricks. But eventually, after much tribulation, Guilliman's crusade fleet broke through to Terra. On Terra, Guilliman became the first loyal Primarch to walk the surface in 10,000 years. He made his way to the Imperial Palace. In a profound, mournful moment, he stood before the Golden Throne and beheld the Emperor, now a silent, withered, yet still powerful psychic presence. Guilliman, who last saw his father hale and commanding on the battlefields of old, was struck with sorrow and outrage at what had become of him, and by extension what had become of the Imperium. Some accounts say Guilliman shed tears or felt a surge of shame for not having been there at Heresy's end. But in that silent communion, the Emperor, perhaps telepathically, gave Guilliman his mandate. Shortly after, Guilliman was recognized as the new Lord Commander of the Imperium, a title not seriously used since he held it in the Scouring era. He took up the governance of the Imperium in the Emperor's name, effectively becoming the Imperium's supreme commander and regent. Guilliman wasted no time implementing a grand plan to save the Imperium from the brink. He launched the Indomitus Crusade, a massive, Imperium-wide counteroffensive and relief effort. One of his first acts was to unveil Belisarius Caul's secret project, the Primaris Space Marines. These were new, enhanced Space Marines, bigger, faster, and engineered with improved gene seed organs that Caul had developed over 10,000 years, with Guilliman's go-ahead before he was put in stasis. Guilliman had tens of thousands of Primaris Marines awakened from Caul's vaults and assigned to bolster the existing chapters and to found entirely new chapters, the Ultima Founding. With these fresh forces, plus the rallying of the Imperial Navy and Astra Militarum, the Indomitus Crusade set out to reconquer and reinforce Imperial territories lost or isolated during the Great Rift's opening. For over a standard century, 112 years by one reckoning, Guilliman led fleets and armies across the ravaged Imperium. He personally fought in countless war zones, bringing hope to besieged planets that thought themselves abandoned. Under his leadership, sector capitals were liberated from chaos occupation, hive fleet incursions were beaten back in places that would surely have fallen, and the light of the Astronomicon was reconnected to far-flung worlds through the creation of the Calixis beacon network. It was a whirlwind of activity that gave humanity some breathing room amid the nightmare. Throughout all this, though, Guilliman never forgot Ultramar. How could he? It was his home and pride. After the initial fervor of the Indomitus Crusade, as things stabilized somewhat, his thoughts returned to his realm. Reports reached him that Mortarion was still a looming threat in Ultramar, turning it into a plague-infested battleground. So, after about a century of crusading, Guilliman decided to wrap up the first phase of Indomitus. The crusade officially culminated in the Battle of Rhokkos, where Guilliman's forces won a decisive victory against Chaos fleets. At that victory celebration, Guilliman announced he would return to Ultramar to address unfinished business. Some in the High Lords Council were apparently nervous he was leaving. Terra again, but he appointed capable agents to continue the crusade in his partial absence. When Guilliman came back to Ultramar around 012M42, he found his realm in the throes of the Plague Wars. Mortarion had entrenched himself in the Scourge Stars, a trident of systems in the warp near Ultramar, and was launching waves of disease and corruption across Ultramar. Several Ultramar worlds had been turned into hellish plague zones. Even beloved Iax, Ultramar's garden world, had been turned into a diseased parody of itself. Nurgle's demons were literally cultivating grotesque organic gardens in its fields. Guilliman essentially arrived just in time for the climactic stage of this war. The Plague Wars were a grinding, nasty conflict unlike any Ultramar had seen. This wasn't just conventional warfare. It was a battle of faith, will, and immune systems, as much as of bullets and blades. Mortarion unleashed all of Nurgle's plagues, one after another, on Ultramar's worlds. Entire cities on worlds like Parmenio and Ardium were quarantined or lost to ghoulifying diseases. The very air turned toxic on some planets, full of unnatural spores. The Ultramarines and their allies, now reinforced with Primaris Marines and other chapter brethren, had to both wage war and play frontline medical responder, burning infection sites, distributing antidotes concocted by Call's tech priests, and so on. Guilliman took command of Ultramar's defense personally. He reorganized the war effort, combining veteran Ultramarine companies with newly arrived Primaris formations, and also coordinating with other Imperial forces that had come to help. Numerous successor chapters answered the call to defend their progenitor's realm. The Genesis chapter, Nova Marines, Mortifactors, etc., all sent units or fought alongside the Ultramarines. Even the Grey Knights, elite demon hunters, and elements of the Mechanicus were involved, given the demonic nature of the foe. Key battles raged on multiple worlds. One was the Konor system campaign, the subject of a major worldwide Warhammer event, where each planet in the system, Konor, Ardium, Drenthal, etc., had to be cleansed of Death Guard forces in turn. Another was on Pythos, an old cursed world from Horus Heresy times, where Mortarion attempted to create a permanent warp rift. But the ultimate showdown took place on Eax, the crown jewel of Ultramar's agriculture and once called the Garden of Ultramar for its beauty. Mortarion targeted Iax for a grand demonstration of Nurgle's power. He wanted to corrupt it into a literal Garden of Nurgle in real space, a perfect spite against Guilliman. On Iax, Guilliman and Mortarion finally met in personal combat amid plague-choked ruins. It was a scene reminiscent of a twisted version of old myth, the shining hero versus the poisoned demon. Mortarion had prepared a special gift for his brother, a disease called the God Blight, so virulent it was said to be capable of killing even a Primarch or Emperor. During their duel, Mortarion managed to land a strike with his scythe, called Silence, that infected Guilliman with this God Blight. Guilliman, despite his strength, began to falter as the noxious corruption spread through his blood. Mortarion gloated and prepared to deliver the killing blow. But then, miracle of miracles, Guilliman was suffused with a burst of golden light. For a brief moment the Emperor acted through him, perhaps in answer to Guilliman's internal prayers, or simply because the Emperor willed his son to live. A tide of pure holy light erupted from Guilliman, burning away the infection instantly. Guilliman stood rejuvenated, and Mortarion was momentarily staggered. Imagine being a demon Primarch and seeing the Emperor's light suddenly manifest. Not a pleasant surprise for a servant of chaos. Seizing that moment, Guilliman struck Mortarion down with the Emperor's sword, badly wounding him. Mortarion, howling in pain and fury, disappeared in a billowing cloud of flies and was banished back to the warp by his patron god. Demon Primarchs, being essentially immortal, don't die easily, but defeat forces them to retreat to the warp for a time. With Mortarion's defeat and withdrawal, the Plague Wars quickly swung in Ultramar's favor. The Death Guard and Nurgle's demons began to lose their footholds or were actively purged from the planets they infested. Iax, unfortunately, had been so contaminated that it was left a near-dead world requiring a massive cleansing effort. Vast swathes of it were quarantined indefinitely. But other worlds, like Konor and Parmenio, were saved from complete destruction, and their rebuilding commenced almost immediately after the plague clouds cleared. In the wake of this hard-won victory, Guilliman took stock of Ultramar's state and the Imperium's needs. He saw both the devastation wrought and the loyalty of worlds beyond his immediate 11 core that had suffered during the war. Some outlying planets, once part of Ultramar in the ancient days but later independent, had fought valiantly alongside his forces or endured great hardship. Others had been less cooperative, with their governors hesitant to support Ultramar's coalition during the crisis. Guilliman essentially decided that Ultramar needed to reclaim its old imperial role. He all but said, "I made a mistake 10 millennia ago by letting Ultramar shrink so much." The days of Ultramar confining itself to a dozen worlds were over. Guilliman would ensure his realm expanded back to its historical borders, both to strengthen the Imperium's position and to protect those wayward human worlds from further harm, with or without their consent. He re-established the ancient ruling council, the Tetrarchs of Ultramar, for this purpose. 4 Tetrarchs, each overseeing a quadrant of the realm, were appointed. These included Severus Agemin, first captain of the Ultramarines, as Tetrarchs of the North, based around the Forge world Connor; Decimus Felix, Guilliman's Primaris Space Marine equerry, as Tetrarch of the East. That region had been once the Sotharan League, but since Sothar was gone, he centered it on the world of Vespator; Captain Balthus of the Doom Eagles chapter as Tetrarch of the West, based on the world of Protos; and Captain Lucian Portin of the Genesis chapter, a successor of the Ultramarines, as Tetrarch of the South, based around the world of Andermung. Each Tetrarch carried symbols of authority, dating back to the Great Crusade, massive square battle standards called the Tetrarch's Mantle, and was charged with bringing their assigned region back under Ultramar's umbrella. Guilliman's message to worlds was clear. Many of them had ancient treaties swearing loyalty to Ultramar from 30,000 days. He expected those to be honored. Some planetary governors readily complied, happy to join the revitalized Ultramar and receive aid and protection. Others tried to play ignorant, claiming they had no record of such treaties or outright refusing, thinking Ultramar had no rightful claim over them after so long. Guilliman, normally patient, had run out of patience for such obstinacy in a time of war. To those who resisted, he effectively delivered an ultimatum: rejoin Ultramar voluntarily and enjoy its benefits, or be removed by force if necessary. He famously told one delegation of recalcitrant bureaucrats something akin to, "Submit or face my righteous vengeance." Ultimately, most worlds saw the writing on the wall and rejoined peacefully, their local leaders adjusting to Guilliman's direct oversight. One imagines more than a few previously corrupt officials were quietly replaced with more virtuous ones in the process. A handful that truly defied him were made examples of. Guilliman sent Space Marines to topple their regimes and install new governors who understood the value of unity. It was a harsher side of Guilliman, but one in line with the ethos that the time for half measures was over. Humanity had to be united to weather the storm of chaos. To defend this burgeoning realm, Guilliman greatly augmented Ultramar's military strength. He permanently stationed 8 newly founded Primaris Space Marine chapters in Ultramar. These are sometimes called the Shield chapters of Ultramar. All were descended from the Ultramarines' gene line, and each was given a homeworld within Ultramar's boundaries. Notable among them, the Avenging Sons, Praetors of Ultramar, Nova Marines, Genesis chapter, which was already there, Doom Eagles, likewise their Tetrarch returned to help, Silver Skulls, Sons of Aurar, and one enigmatically called the Aquilan Shield, also referred to as the Brotherhood of the Aquila in some sources. Additionally, Guilliman reintegrated the Scythes of the Emperor, the nearly destroyed successor chapter, by providing them with Primaris reinforcements and a new homeworld in Ultramar, effectively reviving the chapter. Along with the Ultramarines themselves, this meant Ultramar now boasted roughly 10 full Space Marine chapters dedicated to its defense, the Ultramarines plus 9 others. That's approximately 10,000 Space Marines, a host of the Emperor's finest warriors that could rival the strength of some entire segmentums in the past. And that's in addition to the massive Ultramar Auxilia ground armies, the Ultramar Defense Fleet, which was rebuilt bigger than ever, and the network of star forts, Gallatin, and 5 sister fortresses, all repaired and upgraded post-Plague Wars. It's no exaggeration to say Ultramar in M42 is more heavily defended than Terra was for much of history. By the current time, early to mid-42nd millennium, Ultramar has thus been reborn in a sense. It is no longer just 11 worlds pretending to represent 500. It is actively expanding to reclaim those hundreds of worlds in fact. The realm now spans roughly 3/4 of its pre-heresy expanse, and growing. Guilliman is cautious not to overextend. Expansion is measured and strategic, fortifying each system as it's brought back into the fold. But he's determined. He knows that beyond Ultramar's borders lies the roiling madness of the Great Rift and all its attendant threats, not least the proximity of Mortarian's former domain in the Scourge Stars, where Nurgle still holds sway. Ultramar must become, in effect, the Imperium's bulwark in the east, a bastion of strength and order, where the encroaching darkness can be held at bay. And so, 10,000 years after its founding, Ultramar finds itself both hearkening back to its glorious past and surging into a new future. The Primarch is in command once more, older, perhaps wiser, definitely carrying the weight of the Imperium on his shoulders, but physically present on Macragge's throne nonetheless. The 500 Worlds banner flies again on planets where it had not been seen in millennia. Factories are churning, shipyards launching new fleets for the Imperium's cause. The people of Ultramar, after enduring so much, now look up and see the avenging sun's guiding light, blazing anew. In the next and final section, we'll take a look at what all this means for Ultramar today and going forward. The state of the 500 Worlds in this post-Indomitus, Dark Imperium era, and their role in the ongoing battles of the 42nd millennium. Chapter 9. Ultramar's Future. 500 Worlds and Beyond. Ultramar, as of the present day, late 41st, early 42nd millennium, stands as a shining exception and a linchpin of humanity's fight for survival. It is, once again, a vast domain, not yet fully back to all 500 Worlds of legend, but well on its way. The term 500 Worlds no longer feels like a dusty historical nickname. It's an active mission under Guilliman's direction. Every few months, another world is brought back into the fold, either by diplomatic oath or, if necessary, by the persuasive argument of Space Marine bolters. The Ultramarian Reclamation, as some call it, is ongoing, and it has given the Imperium something it had been sorely lacking: momentum and hope. One front of this campaign has recently drawn much attention: the war against a Necron threat in Ultramar's eastern expanse, specifically around a world called Vespator. Leading the charge there is Captain Demetrios, aka Master of the Watch, Titus of the Ultramarines' Second Company, a name that might ring a bell, as Captain Titus was once famed for battling orcs and chaos on Graia in the Space Marine video game lore, and has now been reintroduced to the setting as a freshly promoted Primaris officer. In this so-called 500 Worlds campaign, Titus and his forces battle the Necron overlord Necrosaur Amintar, who has awoken with designs to eradicate all life across Ultramar's frontier. The Necrons have transformed parts of the Vespator system into killing fields, unleashing legions of undying machines. Titus's Second Company, supported by elements of other SHIELD chapters, is currently locked in a desperate struggle on the Vespator front, one of the key battlegrounds of Guilliman's grand re-expansion. It's a brutal war of attrition and cat and mouse in tunnels and tomb complexes. Even other Necrons fear this particular Necron ruler. Amintar is said to be the origin of the Destroyer curse among Necrons, an utterly nihilistic engine of slaughter. But true to Ultramarine form, Captain Titus is making steady progress, reclaiming outpost after outpost. This campaign, unfolding even as we speak, shows that Ultramar is not just passively rebuilding. It's actively taking the fight to any enemy that dares contest its stars. In daily life across Ultramar's worlds, much has changed, and yet much remains the same. People still go about their business with the orderly efficiency they always have, farming, trading, manufacturing, raising families. But now they do so under the watchful protection of not one but many Space Marine chapters frequently seen in the skies. It's not uncommon on Ultramar worlds to see squadrons of Thunderhawk gunships streak overhead, or to witness columns of power-armored giants marching through a city on some new campaign. Far from causing panic, these sights reassure Ultramar's citizens. They know that the Angels of Death are on their side in Ultramar. Economically, Ultramar is roaring back from the ordeals of the Plague Wars. Guilliman has implemented updated policies, using Mechanicus aid to cleanse and restore agri-worlds like Iax. Though parts of Iax remain quarantined, other fertile continents are being tilled anew. Trade between Ultramar's worlds is in full swing. In fact, Ultramar is exporting its surplus to nearby war-torn sectors that can't feed themselves. The Forge world of Kono is running at peak output, turning out tanks, weapons, and even starship components, not just for Ultramar's own use, but to supply Guilliman's ongoing Indomitus fleets. In many ways, Ultramar is serving as the Imperium's armory and breadbasket in the Segmentum Ultima. One can imagine some bureaucrats on Terra being a bit envious or wary of how self-sufficient Ultramar is. But at the end of the day, the Imperium desperately needs everything Ultramar provides, so any jealousy is tempered by gratitude. Culturally, the rebirth of Ultramar has sparked a resurgence of pride, and even a bit of regional identity. Some might say nationalism, though that word is touchy in the Imperium. The people of Ultramar have always been proud to be of Ultramar, but now that pride is doubled. They endured galactic horrors, and their own Primarch returned to lead them to victory. There's a popular saying spreading on Ultramar worlds that the worst is behind them, and that Guilliman guards Ultramar, and Ultramar guards the Imperium. In the streets, you might hear less outright worship of the Emperor in the imperial cult sense, and more reverent talk of duty to the Emperor's dream as articulated by Guilliman. Guilliman himself has had to walk a tightrope. He doesn't want to be worshipped as some divine figure. He was appalled to see how the Imperium had become a theocracy in his absence, but at the same time he understands the value of symbolism. So, in Macragge's Great Forum, there now stands a new statue, not of Guilliman, but of the Emperor as he was in Guilliman's youth, striding forward with a guiding hand, with a modest little figure of Guilliman at his side. The inscription reads, "To preserve and persevere," a motto encapsulating Ultramar's role. People still pray to the Emperor for protection, but they also take heart that his chosen son is actively out and about making things better. Strategically, Ultramar's importance to the wider Imperium is hard to overstate right now. With the Great Rift splitting the galaxy, stable regions that can serve as bastions and rallying points are few and far between. Ultramar has become the anchor of Imperial order in the Segmentum Ultima, and a large chunk of Segmentum Pacificus by extension. It's a staging area for crusades heading into the dark half of the galaxy, Imperium Nihilus. It's a secure rear area where devastated chapters go to rebuild. For example, the Scythes of the Emperor did so, and others have similar arrangements. It's also something of a political counterweight to Terra, not in a rebellious way, but in a sense that the Lords of Terra know Guilliman has his own power base, and they must cooperate with his initiatives if humanity is to survive. Ultramar's efficient administration has even led Guilliman to pilot certain reforms locally, like more rational tithe schedules or empowerment of competent civilian leaders, with the idea of eventually expanding them imperial-wide if they prove successful. Some on Terra grumble that Ultramar is becoming a state within a state again, but the results speak for themselves. And frankly, Terra has bigger problems with the galaxy burning. Let's not forget, war still rages. Even as we speak, aside from the Necron front mentioned, Ultramar's fleets are battling splinters of Hive Fleet Leviathan that have snaked around the galactic rim to threaten Ultramar from the south. Those Tyranids are being dealt with in a series of running battles on the edges. The Ultramarines' 4th Company earned great glory destroying a tendril at the Battle of Favrinius, for instance. And though Mortarion is banished, the forces of Chaos have not given up on troubling Ultramar. Black Legion warbands, perhaps at Abaddon's behest, occasionally test Ultramar's borders, none yet with any success against its beefed-up defenses. But the threat keeps everyone vigilant. The Word-Bearers, too, have a special hatred for Ultramar. Guilliman is wise to that and keeps particularly alert for their agents trying to sow corruption within. Ultimately, what is Ultramar today? It's the legacy of a Primarch's vision reborn anew. It's a realm that has been to hell and back, yet still manages to function, even thrive, in defiance of everything the grimdark galaxy throws at it. It's a beacon of how the Imperium could be, orderly, prosperous, well-defended, if only there were more Guillimans and 10,000 years of stability to go around. For the average Imperial citizen, life is still hard. Yes, it's the 41st millennium, but on Ultramar worlds you at least get a full stomach, a competent, if stern, governor, and you can expect that your planet's defenses won't just collapse at the first sign of trouble. In short, Ultramar is that faint proof that humanity can achieve something better even in the darkest times. As Guilliman often reminds people, Ultramar doesn't exist as an end unto itself. It serves the Imperium. And indeed, now more than ever, Ultramar is serving as the Imperium's shield and sword on its eastern flank. The Ultramarines and their cohort chapters are constantly dispatching strike forces from Ultramar to trouble spots all across the segmentum. 1 month, an Ultramarines task force is liberating a besieged shrine world 2 sectors away. The next month, a Genesis chapter fleet is smashing a Drukhari, Dark Eldar pirate stronghold that had been preying on refugee convoys heading toward Ultramar. Ultramar isn't isolationist. It's arguably more engaged with the wider Imperium's defense than it ever was. In closing, Ultramar's saga shows us that even in a grim, dark future of unending war, there can be pockets of light and hope. The realm's very existence is a rebuke to those who say the Imperium cannot change or that humanity is doomed to endless decay. Under the guidance of Roboute Guilliman, Ultramar demonstrates that humanity can not only survive the darkness, but even carve out a little bastion of prosperity and order, well defended, of course, by legions of super soldiers and star forts, but a bastion nonetheless. From 1 world to 500, down to a scant few, and now back toward 500 again. Ultramar's history has been a roller coaster of triumph, catastrophe, and renewal. One day, perhaps, the dream of Ultramar, of a just, well-governed human domain where people can live without constant fear, might spread to all corners of the Imperium. Until then, Ultramar stands, as it always has, a bright banner amid the darkness, defiantly proclaiming, "Here, mankind endures and thrives against all odds." And now you know its epic story. From Guilliman's first battles to the 500 Worlds' resurgence in the darkest era. If you ever find yourself a citizen of the Imperium, you might just pray to be born on Ultramar. In the grim darkness of the far future, Ultramar is that rare example of hope that refuses to die. Proof that even when surrounded by endless war, humanity can still aspire to something greater.